Just a heads up before we get into today's video. Go and support the author and check out his YouTube channel, Black Volumes. It'll be linked below in the description. Grandma Erin has always been a wealth of joy and sorrow. The duality of a woman, my mother often jokes. And I've always looked up to her in awe, regardless of whether she was having a good day or a bad day. Because one thing is always true of Grandma Erin. She's as sharp as a tack. Even now, as she lives out the remainder of her days in a nursing home, it's only the physical side of life with which she needs assistance. Her 99-year-old mind remains unthinkably strong. I doubt there are many other centurions or near centurions around with that level of intellect and cognitive aptitude. During my visits to her in the nursing home, I often joke that my 30-year-old mind barely manages to keep up with her century-old mind, only it's hardly a joke at all. "Are you excited for your birthday next year, Grandma?" I asked with a smile. She rolled her eyes. "How excited to have been on this rock for 100 years. Oh, you must be joking, Ted." "But you always say that aging is a gift," I replied with a grin. "Oh, for the 80-year-old kids, sure," she joked with a smile. "But I've been a little sad for the past few years, truth be told, to know that I won't be getting a birthday message from the Queen upon my 100th birthday, should I hit that milestone. Charles is perfectly fine, of course, and I'm sure that his message will be lovely. But I always admired Elizabeth." I smiled and nodded. Yeah, she was something. Grandma Erin rolled her eyes a second time. "No need to pretend, Ted. I know that you're no monarchist, but put politics aside for a second. The fact remains that she was instrumental in helping this country heal. I don't know who I would be without her. Those were some dark, dark years. George VI was a proud and powerful wartime king, but his successor truly shone a light on our country after the war. She made things seem bright again." "I know, Grandma," I said, noting her look out of the nursing home window absent-mindedly, eyeing the town. "I'm sorry." "Oh, pish-posh," she chuckled, waving a hand. "I wasn't telling you off. I just don't want you to think of me as some brainwashed royalist. I value people on their merits. Elizabeth wasn't special to me because she was the queen. This town in particular changed drastically during her reign. It healed." "The war must have been awful," I noted solemnly. And Grandma frowned, still not making eye contact. "Oh, it was, Ted. But it wasn't the nightmare brought from overseas that left its mark on this town. It was what happened." "In the shelter?" I asked. She nodded but said nothing. That was 3 years ago now, and I've been thinking of her admission today as something happened, something that finally triggered the truth. I've heard the whispers, as most folk in this town have, of some tragedy that befell the town in 1941. 2,000 of its 3,000 residents perished in the town's underground air raid shelter, and the exact cause of their demise has, to the most of us, remained a mystery. Only last week, when there came a shrill and haunting sound, an unmistakable fluctuating siren which could only be tied to that bygone era, from the ancient field at the edge of town, did the truth finally spill free. Perhaps it was by chance that I happened to be sitting with my grandma in her room while the siren roared through the streets. Perhaps it was fate. "Holy," I began, leaping from my seat and running to the window. "Is that a—" "No," Grandma Erin sharply replied, though it was an unconvincing answer, the answer from someone who doesn't want to believe. "But Grandma, that sounds like a siren," I said. "Maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's a prank." "Yes," Grandma Erin weakly said, nodding her head firmly. "A practical joke, it must be." I squinted out of the window. Seems to be a lot of commotion up there, but you have to admit, Grandma, that it really does sound like a warning from dead days, she whispered, twitching violently in her chair, arms gripping the rest firmly. It isn't that sound, Ted. That sound does not belong to this time. The siren was decommissioned when I was a kid, right? I asked. Please, Ted, Grandma begged. I don't want to talk about this. Sorry, I said, clearing my throat as I pulled up my phone. I'll see what people are saying on Facebook. Children, Grandma whispered, shuddering as the siren persisted, a traumatic noise for her, no doubt. I felt absolutely awful for the woman being forced to endure that old violent sound. Children have to be behind it, Ted. It's not that. I scrolled down the Facebook page to find, as I had expected, that dozens of people were commenting on the loud and frightening sound filling the town. Some folk had even discussed investigating the source of the sound. The councilman, Martin Blacksmith, explained that the siren wail was coming from the abandoned air raid shelter at the edge of town, and that was when my skin went cold. I didn't want to mention it to Grandma Erin, but I had the feeling that she already knew. Not that she saw it in my eyes or anything, more that she saw something while looking out of the bedroom window, eyeing the town's distant darkness. She was, I realized, looking at the field containing the air raid shelter in the distance. Ted, she began. Yes, Grandma, I asked, sitting back down in a chair opposite of her, while she continued to look out of the window. I think I'm ready, Grandma croaked, nodding at the distance. Ready to tell you what that siren means. I frowned, looking back down at my phone, still open on that Facebook page. People are saying that it's, just a joke, like we said. It's coming from the shelter, Grandma said, matter-of-factly. Oh, thank you, Ted, for telling a white lie. I know you want me to feel better, but I know what I'm hearing. And I suppose I've always known that one day I would have to face the music. There's nobody that I would rather tell than you, Ted. You don't have to tell me anything, Grandma, I promised, reaching out and taking her hand. She shook her head, eyes glued to the window. I've carried this burden for 84 years, Ted. It's time to tell it, my story. I widened my eyes and gulped. You mean? I was there, she interrupted. In that air raid shelter, 15 years of age. Too young to be a nurse, but then all of us were too young or too old for the things that we had to do in those times. I knew boys who fibbed about their ages on conscription forms, as they dreamt of being in the war. And I have no doubt that the horrors that those soldiers saw overseas were the greatest nightmares of all. But that doesn't mean all was calm at home. Did you? I started before taking a gulp. Were you there, Grandma, when it happened, I mean? Grandma Erin nodded, knowing exactly what I meant. Yes, Ted. I saw what happened down there. But I don't understand, Grandma. The story goes that everybody died down there, I said. Yes, well, facts become fudged over time, she replied. I told my family what happened, and my father told, I think, a different version of events to others in the town. He was afraid that they would blame me. Those who had been wise enough not to stay down in that bunker in the warden's prison were the wise ones. The town's fortunate survivors knew perhaps that it wasn't my fault. Whatever awful thing had happened down there. I nodded, considering asking that obvious question. What happened? In truth, I did not want to know, not at all. If I had said anything in that moment, it would have been, please don't tell me. Much like those townsfolk who didn't enter the bunker back in 1941. I knew that the story would be terrible, and I say that as someone who never met this air raid warden, whose shelter Grandma had described as an ominous and depressive place. Air Raid Warden Marlon Presley was an interesting man, Grandma began. Even before the war, when I was a little tot, I remember the things that children and adults alike used to say about him. For a news agent, he was far more of a busybody than he ever had any right being, always trying to get more involved with townfolk's lives than ever seemed appropriate for his status in our town. He wasn't the mayor, wasn't an MP, wasn't a man of any great political importance, though he certainly wanted to be, and he finally had that chance when the Air Raid Precaution Service was set up. Well, naturally, we all volunteered, whether or not we wanted to do so, but Marlon Presley was adamant about being in charge of the air raid shelter being constructed at the farthest edge of town, in one of the disused fields, still disused to this day thanks to all that had happened. Anyhow, the local council recruited Marlon as the warden for the town shelter, and that seemed to improve his temperament. He was kept busy by his warden duties, and that gave the rest of us a break from the headache of listening to his incessant ideas about how we all should be living and breathing and acting in the town, as if it were his society. A little like the folk in charge of homeowners associations in the United States, I asked. Grandma Erin nodded. Yes, I suppose. He had no power, but he liked to believe that he did. What about when he became the air raid warden during the war? I asked. You said that he became better then, more bearable. She frowned. Oh, it certainly seemed that way at first, Ted. I quite liked the man actually, liked him more than I had liked him as a child in the pre-war days. Then again, I forgot that I was still a child during the war. 15, as I said. I worked in the local hospital as a nurse, so whenever the air raid siren sounded, I rushed down into that concrete bunker in my attire, praying and praying that my services wouldn't be needed, that everybody would be kept safe no matter how bad the bombing became, and that I would be kept sheltered from the worst of the war. Most of the time, life in this town was like living in a bubble. I know we're not too far out from London, but for the first year or so of the Blitz, we barely caught any strays. We did not, despite what you may have been led to believe, spend an awful lot of time down in that bunker, and that was all very well for the majority of us, as who on earth would want to spend their time in an underground cage? Those of us who volunteered only did so because it was the right thing to do. Those of us, I should say, except for Warden Marlon Presley. He was the only one of us who loved what he did. Loved, most horrifically of all, being below the ground in that air raid shelter. It was written across his face, while the rest of us cowered and held hands and tried to lighten the mood with jokes or stories. Warden Presley would strut up and down the dining or bunking area with the air of a man taking a leisurely stroll. And as time went by, that leisurely demeanor shifted to one of off-putting and obnoxious pride. I only say this respectively, ashamedly, as I was young and naive at the time. The warden was, at this time in early 1941, quite pleasant towards me. Some of the other girls would roll their eyes when I said as much, calling me a child, a naive little thing who knew nothing of the world. Of course, I would scoff at this. I thought I knew everything about the world, and I resented their suggestions as to the contrary. In my eyes, you see, Warden Marlon Presley was a good man who wanted to save our town from the nasty Germans overseas. He would sound the air raid siren quite frequently in those early months of 1941, I remember. Bombings were happening often in nearby towns and cities, so it only made sense for us to follow the lead of our neighbors and scurry underground any time there was an attack, or merely the whisperings of a potential incoming attack. Resentment built for this reason, I think. Warden Presley became so convinced that we should adopt a better safe than sorry approach to German bombings that he started to sound that awful, shrill, piercing siren as often as possible. Sometimes a couple of nights in a row, even when there had been no word of bombings in the nearby towns or cities for perhaps a week or two. I frowned at this point in Grandma's story. What do you mean? He just liked the power of sounding the siren and having all the townsfolk answer his call. Grandma Erin shook her head. Power certainly drove him, but it was about more than the bells and whistles of his position. Truly as much as I would have claimed otherwise as that foolish girl that I had become at the time, the man didn't care about the war effort, and didn't care about his role as an air raid warden. He cared only about this town, and he always had, but not in the sense that we were his neighbors or friends or even loved ones, as he had occasionally claimed. For Marlon Presley, the goal was, as it had always been, was to corral us into that underground prison. But why? I asked. I understand that he had been some overbearing busybody above ground, always trying to meddle in other people's business and gain some sense of power over the town. But the air raid shelter was just a meddling concrete box, wasn't it? Even in such a position of power, if one views an air raid warden as a powerful person, why would Presley have enjoyed being in that horrid claustrophobic with the rest of you? Because it wasn't a prison to him, Ted, Grandma Erin explained. It may have started out that way, small and cramped, but he worked hard to make it more than that. It started out as a single hallway and no more than a row of bunks and boxes of supplies, enough to keep us going for hours at a time. But the warden had wanted a more long-term solution. He wanted a bigger and more spacious environment in which we could dwell for prolonged periods of time. A town below the town, he used to say. So he convinced the council to invest in more bunks and a functional dining area, ramshackle bathrooms and offices for him and a select few other members of staff too. I was too young to fully understand any of it at the time, but my father told me long after the war that Marlon had friends on the council, corrupted folk willing to invest funds in whatever asinine plan that tyrant had in mind. You speak of him so violently now, I noted, squeezing my grandmother's hand tightly. Yet you said before that you were quite fond of him at the time. Awful things happened in that place, Ted, my grandma explained. But awful things were happening long before then, you must understand. And I bought the warden's bright and beautiful story of some utopian underworld, of a town below, the nightmare above, away from war. As I said, and I will continue to say, I was a stupid, stupid girl. I squeezed her hand again. Don't say that about yourself, Grandma. You were young and it must have been a dreadful time to be alive. You don't have to continue if you... I do, she interjected with a slight flutter in her voice. A lump at the top of her throat betrayed her unsteadiness. As much as she was trying to maintain a cool, collected demeanor, no matter what she said, I knew that she did not want to be recounting this direful tale. Okay, I said, nodding softly. Just take your time. I'm cautious for your sake, Ted, Grandma explained to me. You'll never, thank the Lord, have to experience what I and the others experienced down in Presley's bunker, and I would never ever want you to endure anything like that firsthand. She paused, letting the real-life air raid siren fill the quiet for a few moments. That siren rolling over the hills and gushing through the streets is more than a symbol of that bygone time, Ted. It's real. I frowned. It's not real, Grandma. As I said, the siren was decommissioned in the 90s, perhaps before I was even born, and I'm not that young. It's the sound of some children playing a prank. I promise you that. Martin will find the... I trailed off, releasing my mistake, but Grandma had already sat up straight in her chair. Martin Blacksmith, she asked, finally twisting her head towards me. What did he say? Nothing, I lied. She didn't press me for an answer, with the widening of her eyes and the nodding of her head. it became apparent that she had already deduced exactly what Martin had found. The shelter, that's where he's gone, isn't it? I sighed and shrugged. Grandma, I don't. It's okay, Ted. I already knew the sound was coming from there. She interrupted, nodding again at the window. I can feel it pouring across the landscape, pouring out of that dark, dark hole. I paused, thinking for the first time in my life that Grandma was starting to sound her age. That dose of senility had slipped through the cracks of her words. She had always been, as I said, so sharp and so tuned into reality. Yet for the first time ever, she sounded detached from the truth. And I scolded myself for viewing her this way, as I knew that, no doubt, wartime trauma had something to do with her odd demeanor. Her jittery hands, watery eyes, and absent-minded recounting of her history. The truth of the matter was far more horrendous than anything I could have imagined. Grandma Erin's trauma did not come from the war fought above the ground, but the war fought beneath it. A war that had nothing to do with the German regime, and everything to do with air raid warden Marlon Presley. As Marlon expanded his underground world over which he reigned supreme, he began to ring the siren more and more often. I think by the spring of 1941 he had started to ring it every single night, had started to encourage these citizens of our town to essentially live down there. When people would come back up for air returning to their homes, they would be chastised by Presley for doing so, told that they were putting their lives at risk, for the bombs could drop at any time. Though often we would go for a month or two at a time without bombs landing anywhere within the immediate vicinity of our town. Folks were cut right down the middle. While nearly everyone other than a few deluded individuals such as me hated the warden, they feared the war more. Propaganda was rife, and the Germans had become such an oppressive concept in the public conscious that many became convinced it was only a matter of time before they had landed on our shores and conquered cities, towns, and villages. So, as much as they detested the warden's underworld of squalor and darkness, they feared the war above more. Roughly 2/3 of the town abided by the sirens when they sounded each night, scurrying back into the bunker, and hundreds of folks stayed down there permanently, convinced by the warden's claims that at any time, a loose bomb might land on their heads. Most of the townspeople only went above the surface at all, in fact, to round up supplies for the bunker, more rations and water and other essentials, and of course, given the amenities such as working bathrooms that the warden had installed, air raid precaution staff had to dispose of the waste. Jesus, Grandma, I said, sighing heavily. I'm so sorry that you were forced to essentially live down there. Entertainment spaces and other commodities were installed in the cafeteria, and Grandma continued. It all sounds rather lovely when packaged in a certain way, and I remember one of the other girls, a nurse named Betty who was about 4 years older than me, used to joke that Warden Presley had learned how to develop such a persuasive propaganda strategy from the leader of Germany himself. Well, of course, I didn't like that, and I told her as much. Told her that the warden was only keeping us down below the surface for such extended periods of time to keep us safe, that it only takes one stray bomb to end a life, and all of our lives. Such we stay above the surface like the other fools from the town who were, in my opinion, being pig-headed by ignoring Presley's nightly air raid sirens and staying in their homes. Nurse Betty told me that she envied those lucky souls who had the freedom to stay above ground. She would have loved to do so if she hadn't committed herself to the war effort, to providing medical assistance to soldiers and civilians alike, I should say. She had a duty to be down there with us and the other volunteers for the air raid precautions. Anyhow, Betty was quite patient with me, all things considered, for many months. But by that late spring, when most people had tired of the warden's overzealous sounding of the air raid siren, the girl must have reached her wit's end. She finally snapped at me, saying what so many others had already said, that I was a child who shouldn't be running her mouth. A child who, as far as Betty was concerned, shouldn't even be down there. Should be above ground with my father, who was smart enough to stay in his home. In all honesty, I didn't have a horse in the race. I didn't care much for the rumors and gossip about Warden Presley's oppressive regime, in which few felt allowed to even come up for air. In my eyes, they were selfish and ungrateful, not considering the risk in which they might be putting us all by opening the doors to our haven. All it would take is one stray bomb, the warden would tell us. And those words rang throughout my head whenever I considered, for even a second, going above ground. I suppose I also didn't really share the concerns of the others in that bunker because I was so young, just a child who cared only about the war ending, about making it out in one piece. And at 15 years of age, I still viewed my entire life as something that was ahead of me. I knew that in time the war would end, and I would emerge from that shelter ready to live the rest of my life, a free person. The old citizens, on the other hand, were likely conscious of the fact that their final few years on this earth were being wasted, that they too would waste away in what I heard many refer to as a crypt. I remember overhearing one man say that the bunker would be the death of us all, that we would be buried there, My grandma trailed off and began sobbing, so I got up from my chair to offer her a tight embrace. I was already horrified by the story that she had told, and I truly believed that this horrifying story would come fully down to a warden who overexerted his power, that perhaps a bombing or some disease spreading through the bunker had been the cause of the many deaths in that underground prison. The truth would prove to be far, far worse, though. "Don't ask me not to continue," Grandma Erin said, sniffling and patting my back before I returned to my seat. "I know those are the words dancing on the tip of your tongue." I shook my head and pointed to my sealed lips, so she nodded with a slight smile. "Good," she whispered, dabbing a teary eye, "because I can't stop now, Ted. If I stop now, then I'll never start again. And this story..." She paused, wincing at the never-ending air raid siren blaring through the streets of our town. "This story, it needs to be told, Ted. I shouldn't have kept it under wraps for so many decades. It was wrong of me, it was cowardly, but my father... I nodded, taking Grandma's hand again but saying nothing. I didn't want to interrupt her flow. Didn't want to upset or agitate her by suggesting that she stop. I knew that she needed this experience, that she was seeking some sort of catharsis. But what I still didn't understand or didn't appreciate, in spite of her many warnings, was that her hesitation had only been for my benefit, that she was in fact unsure as to whether I should carry the burden of knowledge which had cursed her for so many years. I should have begged her far more firmly, either begged her not to tell me what had happened or perhaps simply just got up and left. I will never be the same, knowing what I know now. "Before I tell you of my father and what happened in the town following the war, I must tell you what happened," she croaked. "Tell you how those poor people died while I lived, the only survivor of that horror. I suppose I should start by defending myself, explaining how I missed the signs that something was wrong, where others, even young girls such as Betty, seem so aware. I think of her often, think of the life she might have lived, the life she deserved to live perhaps, as she was so aware. Why was she so aware, I wonder? Well, I suppose I may well know because... Oh, Ted." "Are you okay, Grandma?" I asked. She nodded weakly and then shook her head. "It is only now in retrospect that I realize there were horrors unfolding in that bunker long before those hundreds of people perished in the most unimaginably... Well, I'll get to that. I'm sorry, I'm struggling, Ted. but I think you ought to know. Somebody ought to know, as I'm an old woman and this secret shouldn't die with me, especially if it hasn't really died at all." Grandma Erin nodded at the window, indicating the siren blaring. The siren that she was certain, much like Councilman Blacksmith, had to be spilling out of the bunker which had been abandoned more than 80 years ago. I was close to Warden Presley because he was nice to me. I've told you that, haven't I? But I suppose I haven't elaborated. You see, he was nice to many of the girls, and I'm sure you might be able to imagine, at no great stretch of the imagination, why that was so. Don't worry, he never did anything to me, so wipe that haunted look off your face, Ted. I'm fine. I'm just thinking of Betty, thinking of why she hated him so greatly. And I remember the revulsion which spread across her face whenever he came near. Remember how she recoiled from his hands, near jumping away from him when he tried to pat her on the shoulder once. I think I may well have avoided a near escape. Perhaps if I had been a little older, I would have endured whatever she endured. Jesus, I gasped. She nodded. And I was a fool not to know at the time. Or perhaps that's too self-deprecating, too harsh. These are things that a 15-year-old girl wouldn't necessarily understand, especially in those times, but I understand now. I remember the horror in Betty's face. I remember the things she said about Warden Presley, and I'm absolutely certain that something happened. What, I do not know. I only hope that it was perhaps the threat of something happening. Not actually. I don't know, Ted. Perhaps I'm saying this to merely put myself at ease. Anyhow, the point is that it all seems much clearer now. The disingenuous of that man. He would invite me into his office for little chats, and he would talk about the other nurses, would talk about what they wanted out of life. Families, vocations, how many children, what sort of interest did they have beyond the expected duties of a woman? What did they want out of life after the war? Once we have defeated the enemy, he once said, we must look to ways of keeping the ethos of the shelter alive. This community that we built is one that must be preserved at all costs. Those are the words which ring the loudest in my head. I think as even at the time I was aware of the fact that Presley dreamt of being more than an air raid warden. He wanted power, as others had said, and I knew this. I simply didn't understand that he craved power for nefarious reasons. I believed, as any child would, in the simplicity of the utopia that he presented in his speeches to the community. I believed in the things that he said during his talks, that he was looking for a nice woman to help him start a family, that he was looking for citizens who would help him maintain the world that he had built in that bunker, and carry those lessons and practices out into the post-war world, which he admitted might be coming any day now. I nodded. In all honesty, I thought he might have enjoyed the war, enjoyed the power that he wielded in that underground world. It seemed strange that he would talk fondly of the end of the war and the end of his reign as the warden. Grandma Erin sighed. He believed, I think, in the world of which he so frequently spoke, believed that he would achieve his goal of becoming a leader in a broader sense, perhaps becoming the mayor of our town or an MP in the local government. He was as deluded as me, I think. He saw how infatuated a select few people, such as a few of the other brainwashed ARP staff members and me, were with him, and tricked himself into believing that this community at large would be on board with this monster ruling over our town in the future. He didn't understand that fear was what kept the townsfolk in that underground prison, fear of the war above ground. Perhaps some bought into his propaganda. Perhaps some actually believed that each and every air raid siren ringing every day bore some relevance to sightings of German bombers. But I think that most of us were gathering down there out of habit, due to a sense of loss perhaps, as to what we were supposed to be doing. Even when we didn't see planes in the sky or soldiers in the street, talk of the war was everywhere. in the paper, on the radio, from the mouths of those volunteering for the air raid precautions. The only place from which we could escape the horror of the death and the suffering and the never-ending threat was in that concrete box below the soil. I know that sounds ludicrous. It didn't sound ludicrous to me as a child, but it certainly should have. And that explains the root of my survivor's guilt, I suppose. There were so many in that bunker who sensed that something was wrong with Warden Presley, whereas I didn't. Why should I live while they all died? That's the question I've asked myself for decades upon decades, Ted, and it's one that I think has no just answer, just sheer dumb, horrid luck. Grandma, I began, placing a second hand on her quaking one. You deserve to live. You may not think as such when I've reached the end of my tale, Ted, she whispered, squeezing her watery eyes together. I suppose it must have been April if my memory serves, when the horror extended beyond Warden Presley's mistreatment of young women and the townsfolk who he so masterfully duped into essentially living down there. There came a new threat, a threat of a revolt. I overheard a pair of volunteers for air raid precautions discussing the ever-popular matter of our not-so-believed leader, their boss, as they so fictitiously referred to Warden Presley. One of the men talked of overthrowing the warden, as he claimed that Marlin had become drunk on power, that he had forgotten they were all supposed to work together as a community, not live under the thumb of one person. The other man agreed, saying that Marlin had reprimanded him for going above the surface to spend a night in his own home. Marlin threatened to send word to the government of the volunteers' betrayal, and this man had threatened the warden to do so. He had admitted growing tired of the warden's overreach. Anyhow, these two men shared their stories, working themselves into a frenzy as they heard of the ways in which Warden Marlin Presley had mistreated them, mistreated many of the volunteers in the bunker, and I was starting to feel for them, starting to think that they might be right, when one of them suggested something that snapped me back into my brainwashing, infatuated mindset. He told his friend that they ought to kill Marlin in the dead of night. I panicked, shivering in the hiding spot behind the bunk bed from which I was eavesdropping. I think it's worth mentioning that the other volunteer immediately shook his head and talked his friend down, saying that they weren't murderers, that the warden didn't deserve to die for his insanity, as he had not fully restricted their movements and comings and goings. He had simply overstayed his welcome. Instead of outright murder, the more level-headed but nearly as violent volunteers suggested that they find a way to replace the warden with somebody new, somebody better suited. His idea was to poison Marlin, not with anything lethal but something sufficient to leave the warden suitably incapacitated and out of the running for such a leadership role, so to speak. If the warden were left bedridden and physically depleted, he would struggle to maintain his vice-like grip on the community. That was the general idea in any case. They planned to get Sheffy, as they called the shelter's main cook, to lace his meals with something nasty. I don't recall what they said. My ears were ringing too loudly as I contemplated in fear what all of this meant. Even if they weren't planning to kill R, in my eyes, fearless leader, they were planning to harm him. It was treason. I think I may have even convinced myself momentarily that these were the agents of Germany sent to infiltrate our shelter and kill us all. So in my stupidity as a young girl, I did something which I will forever regret. I went to Warden Presley. I still remember walking into his office, catching him off guard. The man usually invited me to see him, and he wasn't fond of unexpected, unplanned calls. I remember the shock on his face as I came barging into the room, my own face in a flood of tears, but I quickly explained that I had a good reason to come in unannounced. that there was an emergency. A mutiny on land, I said, if such a term suits this incident. I remember the slamming of drawers, the way in which he hurriedly hid papers which were drowning his desk. There was a lurch in my stomach as I briefly eyed the diagrams on the sheets, surrounded by blocks of text. I don't know why, but those symbols didn't sit well with me, Ted, and I doubt they would have sat well with you either if you had seen them. I knew nothing of the way in which the warden spent his days in that office, but I know what I felt in my gut as I looked upon the paper. Wrongness. A sense of something unnatural that had been inked onto those pages. He tried to distract me from whatever I had seen by shouting at me, yelling at me to spit out whatever supposed emergency had called for the unwarranted interruption. That was the first time that I had ever seen that other side of Presley, the side of which so many others in the shelter often spoke. A cold, unrelenting, and inhuman side. A side so far from that soft man I had known for many months. Perhaps that should have stopped me. His harsh disposition and the haunting nature of the symbols that I had seen on the paper, which seemed to bleed through my retinas, spilling awful, diabolical secrets which made no sense to me, perhaps would have made sense to me if I had read the text surrounding them. Of course, I'm glad that I didn't read a word, as I think that would have brought greater depths of terror to my experience, would have taught me things that offered context to the nightmare which was to come. And I want so desperately not to know any of it, Ted. Oh gosh, what am I doing? You shouldn't hear any of this. It's not right. It's not needed. It is needed, Grandma, I said naively. It's needed for you. I see that now. See that the heaviness you've carried for years on those dark days between the light ones has all been linked to this dreadful wartime experience, hasn't it? She nodded. Yes. Well then, I continued, you need to tell me what happened to you and the rest of those people. You need to tell me what the warden did all those years ago, so that you might finally have peace, peace that you should have had a long time ago. You still speak as if I deserve to be happy, and Grandma Erin whispered, but she continued. Well, I told him. I told the warden of the volunteers' plans to overthrow him by making him poorly and then finding someone fitter, someone who would be more physically appropriate in the role. And I even told him that one of the men frightened me by expressing murderous intent. Well, the warden's eyes softened upon learning of this. Primarily, I think, because he had hidden the documents and I no longer seemed concerned by them, by the strangeness of whatever Marlin had been studying. I was firmly focused on the two men making loose threats, which might not have any basis at all. Thank you for coming to me, Erin, the warden gently said, taking my hand and smiling. I will resolve this. You're a blessed child and you will feel in time the touch of God. More words that ring in my head incessantly. I'll never forget the tone of his voice, the falseness of his eyes, though his demeanor seemed so genuine and convincing to me at the time. And I'll never forget the phrasing, though it certainly meant nothing to me at the time. The touch of God. What did he mean? I asked with a gulp, perhaps trying to delay the next part of my grandmother's story, which I suspected would be far worse than the first. Grandma Erin shuddered in her seat. Well, first of all, let's talk about the dissenters. This was the true turning point for our little underground community, the price paid by those two volunteers who had been talking and scheming behind Warden Presley's back. I was dining in the cafeteria with Betty as I often did in spite of our differences. Differences that finally came to the forefront when there came a loud commotion from the back of the dining hall. Into the room came ARP staff, those still loyal to the warden, who dragged the two supposedly treacherous volunteers kicking and screaming through the hallway. Well, of course, people jumped to their feet, asking what on earth was happening, asking what the two men had done. And the ARP enforcers barked back that these were German spies sent to kill the warden, sent to tear the town apart from the inside. Hearing those words aloud, I realized how foolish it all sounded. Realized that I had been a silly little girl for even imagining such a thing. And of course, this was the sentiment shared by most of the onlooking townsfolk in the dining hall. People called the ARP enforcers the lunatics, said these two traitorous men had been members of the town's community for decades and were in no way, shape, or form connected to Germany. Well, of course, the enforcers explained that they were simply following orders, and a few loud voices retorted that German soldiers were only following orders too. I resented Betty's claim that Marlin was a fascist, no better than the Fuhrer himself. Perhaps because it had struck a chord deep within me, finally opening my eyes to the naivety and lunacy of the way that I had been acting and thinking for months. I snapped back at the older girl, simply as a way of venting my frustrations, that Marlin was here to save us all, that he was keeping us safe from Germany on the inside. Betty turned to me, narrowed her eyes, and called me an empty-headed little girl once again. I recall, much to my shame, lifting a hand to fling a slap at the older girl, but I caught myself just in time. Not before my fellow nurse had clocked that knee-jerk reaction, of course, and simply offered me a pitying headshake. Once again, she called me a child and said that if I had any value for myself whatsoever, I ought to steer clear of the warden. That was when she admitted it in a whisper drowned out by the arguing citizens and ARP enforcers, creating a ruckus towards the other side of the dining room. She said that the warden had made numerous advances on her over the years, just as I had told you before. But I still remember her opening her lips to tell me something else, some other awful thing that had befallen her perhaps, and that she stopped short of saying whatever she was going to say clearly for my benefit. I think often of what she might have been on the verge of telling me, something else that had happened, something that she feared might happen perhaps. Whatever the case, the girl brought the conversation to a close by asserting that Marlin had no heart, no matter how much he may claim otherwise. And just as I was about to retort something, likely vile and unwarranted, there came two sounds which halted my lips and skipped my heart. Gunshots. I gripped my grandma's hand, horrified by this admission, horrified that there had been more to the story of those dead townsfolk than the horrors of the war above. A stray bomb or a disease that had spread like wildfire through the close quarters of that under-earth prison. It became clear to me in that moment that the truth was something far different. Grandma Erin trembled as she continued. There came a moment of silence following the shots, and then followed screams. Anybody not already on their feet jumped up, and we all surged towards the exit of the dining area, surged into the adjoining corridor which formed a bridge between the cafeteria and the bunking area. And there they lay, the two dissenters, as Marlin Presley had called them, lying in a pool of their own blood, with the four enforcers standing motionlessly and soundlessly above them. One held his revolver in a jittery hand, seemingly only just coming to grips with what he had done. I don't know whether he had meant to kill the dissenters. Perhaps there had simply been a struggle and the gun had accidentally fired. Perhaps the enforcer had squeezed the trigger in a fit of rage. Whatever the case, the mob was enraged, and they swarmed at the officers. Betty and I watched in frozen fear as the crowd poured past us, a crowd which must have numbered a couple hundred in the dining area, and a few hundred pouring in from the bunking area. I winced, preparing to hear more gunshots, but the armed enforcer didn't fire a single bullet. There came the screams of those four men, brainwashed fools just like me, only they were the fools fated to feel the bludgeoning fists of hundreds upon hundreds of maddened townspeople. Their cries didn't last for long. They were buried beneath the squelches and crunches of flying knuckles and shoe soles, and perhaps even loose instruments that the enraged citizens had on hand. I felt a little nauseated at this point. It had sickened me enough to imagine those guards, or volunteers I should say, shooting two of their own. Two men culpable of no real crime other than discussing, with no evidence of any actual crime having taken place, or been on the verge of even taking place. For most volunteers and citizens in that place were, by the sounds of Grandma's story, prone to running their mouths, of venting their violent frustrations with no actual intent of doing anything. Yet still, despite the awfulness regarding that initial part of the story, it was my grandmother's recounting of the vicious bludgeoning, the way in which those bodies were pulped into nothingness that truly set my teeth on edge, and brought the vomit bubbling up to the top of my throat. To be told that humans suffered that way, even those who had made the fatal error of shooting two innocent men, was painful. It was hard to imagine and even harder to stomach. I remember keeling over and hurling onto the floor, which earned me a half-empathetic back rub from Betty, who whispered something along the lines of it being okay, that it wasn't my fault. Her voice sounded husky and sore, as if she were holding back her own tears for the sake of keeping me sane and safe in the midst of that furious yet horrified mob. I'm thankful for that, is all I managed to say in the wake of that terrifying and sickening scene was, I killed him. As I said, as she assured me otherwise, and that everyone would be okay as we slowly followed the rest of the townsfolk. Hundreds upon hundreds of captives in that concrete underworld. The thunder of cries and screams and horror was deafening as we surged onwards, and Betty tried to the best of her ability to stop me from looking down at my feet as we were walking through the adjoining hallway between the dining area and the bunking room, but that only made me want to look down more. That and the squelch of something wet and thick and gooey beneath the flimsy soles of my shoes. I whimpered as I looked down and saw the mushy guts and bones and mauled flesh that served as the meager and macabre remnants of those 4 ARP volunteers who, at the hands of a select few or a select many mob members, met their wretched and unthinkable fates. Deserved or not, it was haunting to see the desecrated and, to be frank, near non-existent remains of those volunteers. But what really stood out on the flesh of one man who had not been mauled quite as severely as the others was the symbol, a scar on his fleshy remnant, a triangular symbol reminiscent of one of the shapes that I had glimpsed for only a moment on a paper that Warden Presley had hurriedly shoved away into his drawer out of my sight. I frowned at this point. You think they were? I paused, reconsidering for a moment, but then I asked it. Do you think they were working together? I mean, evidently they were all united in terms of serving the air raid service, but I just wonder whether the symbols were evidence of. It sounds silly to say. It was no cult, if you mean to say as such, my grandma explained. There was something more to those symbols, Ted. I know you looked at me as if I were senile when I said as such, because you're doing the same right now, but I felt something, okay? The same thing that I felt when I looked at that triangular symbol in particular, on the strip of flesh embedded into the floor by boot prints. I gulped at Grandma's vivid descriptions, still too horrified by the tale that she had told of mankind's brutality to truly grasp what she was saying, to pay any mind to the mutterings, which seemed to be verging on something supernatural. Some manner of magical thinking as far as I was concerned. And I was right. It was a vibration of sorts. Grandma Erin moaned, shivering as she looked out of the window again, shivering as if she were feeling that vibration coursing through her ancient and withered body, as if the ever-roaring air raid siren were causing the frequency to course through her bones once more. Well, that sounds like fear to me, Grandma. Fear and trauma mixed into one horrid swirl, I said. Perfectly natural given the circumstances. It was the same feeling in the warden's office when I saw the symbol for the first time. A triangle with a horizontal line protruding from its upper vertex, she said, drawing the symbol for me in the air. I felt a wave of nausea as she did so. A fluttering of the chest and a tide of goosebumps flooding across my skin from toes to top. and it was in a sense a vibration in my own body. But I berated myself for thinking as such, berated myself for letting myself fall into the same trap as my grandmother, as horrible as her story had been. It couldn't be true, I told myself. I had to believe it wasn't true because the alternative, of course, was that all I had ever known about reality must have been a lie, that there were hidden things, truths, and terrors buried within the very tapestry of reality itself. Who would want to believe such a thing? Believe that something as intangible as a symbol drawn on a scrap of paper or etched into a human's flesh could be anything more than that, a drawing. Yet as I tried to shake off that haunted feeling in my chest, driven by a sort of, yes, vibration, I started to consider that Grandma Erin might not be senile at all, and that thought filled me with a greater dread than anything else. Grandma Erin lowered her finger, noting my distress, and then nodded. I'm sorry, Ted, but that feeling's real. That tightness in your core, in your chest, and in your head. There was something terrible about that symbol, about all the symbols. And Warden Marlon Presley knew that. He had been studying something in that study of his. Something that... Okay, I'm going to tell you the rest, Ted. I'm going to tell you what happened to the others in that bunker. As I'm sure you're aware that more than 6 people died on that night. 967 souls were lost in that bunker. Though most simply talk of around 1,000. But it wasn't 1,000. It was 967. You see, I remember each and every face lost in that bunker. Do you understand, Ted? I remember each of them, but I shouldn't. I didn't even know many of those town residents. And even after months down there, how would I be able to recall each and every person? It's an impossibility. Yet I remember them all the same. How is that so, Ted? How is it that I see their faces at night, and have done for the past 84 years? I fear that it has something to do with those symbols, with those things that I saw and felt and experienced, with whatever Marlon Presley did to me. I may have survived, Ted, but a piece of me died down there with the rest of them. What happened, Grandma? I croaked. What happened after the mob killed Marlon's men? Grandma Erin nodded, as if accepting that the time had come to tell the part of the story which had been wrapped and misrepresented by rumors in the town for years, decades. There were so many people, Ted. A little under 1,000 people might look insignificant in, say, a city square, but in a narrow corridor 15 or 20 meters wide, I would say, if I had to guess, 1,000 people suddenly looks like 10 or 20,000, maybe 1,000,000 for a 15-year-old girl who doesn't know much. And as we surged forwards, sliding through that bunking hallway, I started to feel the folk towards the back of the crowd pushing more aggressively into Betty and me, trying to get to the front. You see, we were all converging on a point near the doors at the bunker's entrance. Now I was quite far back, so it was hard to hear much over the roar of voices, but words were passed down the crowd like the telephone game. You know, one whisper is passed to the next and so on. But Betty said that we had to know what was happening, and so she yanked me to the side and we slid between 2 of the bunk beds, cutting through to a slim passage on the other side. Dozens of others had come to the same realization, of course, that this was a quicker way of getting to the front, circumventing the crowd, so to speak. Anyhow, the closer we got to the source of the uproar, the clearer the entrance became. The clearer the man before the entrance became. It was, of course, Warden Marlon Presley, and he was wearing a large grin on his face as he folded his arms tightly. I saw a couple of men rush past him and bang roughly on the doors, banging until they wailed from the pain of their weak and flimsy fists, bouncing off of the unthinkably thick steel. He had sealed it somehow. The warden had bolted the doors in a way that only he knew how to unlock. And then came the threats. 2 of the men seized Presley and hoisted him up against the wall of the stairwell, leading up to the doors, and told him that he'd better spill, and that he'd better open up those blasted doors so that they would grind him into nothing. And the worst part, Ted, is that he just laughed. It was an awful laugh, and it came with an awful smile. Marlon told us, all of us, that we would never be able to get the doors open without him, that he was the one and only to reign over us, keeping us safe from the horrors above, that we should be grateful to be locked down there away from it all, where we could live in peace forever, in our own twisted little society. Well, of course, the two attackers called him insane, as did other voices at the forefront of the crowd, those close enough to hear Marlon's insane ramblings. And this went on for several minutes, with the two men getting increasingly agitated. Then all of a sudden, somebody snapped. A man shoved his way to the front of the crowd and barreled towards the warden, and once his fist had started flying, I gasped, thinking somebody would stop him, but it was a domino effect. The other men joined in, and the fists flew into Marlon's face, flew and flew and flew, and people rejoiced once they realized what was happening. There were some murmurings of horror from citizens, of course, as there had been when the 4 volunteers had been bludgeoned. Nobody wanted the violence, or at least most folk didn't. They hated the men and hated their prison. But in all truth, we all still had the option to leave, or at least felt like we did. Then again, perhaps that was a lie too. Even I didn't want to be down there. Not really. I felt trapped. Other townsfolk had escaped from the warden's clutches, ignoring the air raid sirens and staying up in their homes away from all of this. Anyhow, my point is that they escaped, but we didn't. Sure, we were scared of the war. I mean, everybody was scared of it. But why did we stay? And why did we just stand there and watch as those men pummeled Marlon Presley's face into nothing? I only started sobbing when I snapped out of it, that frozen trance. Snapped out of it and realized that the air raid warden, still wearing his helmet with the large W plastered across it, was being held up by the tight grip of one of the assaulters. He wasn't moving of his own accord. Marlon's face had been reduced to, well, there was nothing left of it, Ted. It had been caved inwards, reduced to a bloody, scooped-out chasm. Jesus, I gasped, wondering what greater horrors could lie in store. So you were all trapped down there after Marlon died? And Grandma Erin nodded, but then she shook her head as if reconsidering. That isn't what happened to them, Ted. Yes, we were trapped. Yes, the doors were locked. And yes, Marlon was murdered by those men. And to have then starved to death down there would have been a nightmare, no doubt. But it was worse than that, my boy. I don't know whether you'll believe me. I've tried to tell you what happened with the symbols, but you just don't listen. And now I don't know whether you'll believe me when I tell you what happened next. I nodded slowly. I'll try, Grandma. And I meant it because as much as I had pretended otherwise, I felt something in my bones, something unnatural and inexplicable. When she had drawn that symbol in the air, I knew that I might well be losing my marbles too, but I was ready for it. The explanation, that was what I told myself until the revelation came. I'm ready. But I wasn't. While we were looking at the limp corpse being held in that man's hands and word was being passed down the crowd as to what had happened, there came the sound of laughing from the back of the corridor towards the dining area. Grandma explained, hands twitching nervously, and then that was when the screaming started. That was when Betty and I turned along with others to see something inexplicable. Blood. So much of it, a wave of it, and it was tearing through the crowd. That was how it seemed at first, but then we realized that the crowd had become blood. What? I asked. Grandma, you're not making any sense. She gulped. It didn't make sense, not until the chaos had reached us, had torn through hundreds and hundreds of people. They were being torn to pieces, reduced to blood and guts and bones, and dying shrieks reverberating off the brickwork and the concrete. And in the midst of it all, when there were only 100 or so survivors left huddling towards the entrance, we saw an impossibility. Marlon Presley, only Marlon Presley, was being held as a corpse in the hands of that quaking citizen by the entrance. Yet there he was, a clone, a doppelganger, I don't know, a ghost. An undead version of that body which we all could see plainly as a lifeless corpse. And that undead man walked slowly towards the remaining townsfolk, did not wear that ghastly smile on his face. He wore no expression, for his face was caved inwards, impossibly like the dead body we saw by the entrance. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "Grandma, you said you would try to believe me." She interjected, tearing up, and the real-world siren suddenly stopped. "Oh God, why where has it gone?" "I don't know," I said. "Just tell me what happened to the others." "The same thing that happened to the hundreds before them," Grandma croaked. "He tore through them like a storm. He walked through them, not lifting a limb, and they screamed, clutching their faces as the features caved inwards and turned into bloody pools of mush, much as it happened to Marlon Presley himself. It was vengeance, retribution, but it was, I know, an impossibility, supernatural, a lie unbound by the laws of nature. Betty and I tried to get away. We were the last two, pressing up against the doorway, banging and screaming, and I felt breath on my neck, hot and heavy, before Betty was pulled away from me, shrieking for mercy as the crunching of bones and squelching of blood and mush began, as she was turned into nothing. And then only I remained, the only one spared, and I squeezed my eyes closed, feeling that thing, that undead thing mimicking Marlon Presley's corpse, which lay at my feet yet somehow impossibly stood behind me, as some eternal specter. I prepared for death, but death did not come. There was a heavy bang of steel scraping steel, and then the squeak of hinges giving way as some complex mechanism undid itself. I didn't open my eyes until the breathing faded away and the corpse at my feet had been dragged down the steps, across the floor, and far, far away from me. When I opened my eyes, the bunker doors were opened and I fled, into the field and far, far away from the shelter, into the night, into the arms of my father waiting at home for me with a worried expression on his face. He didn't know. Nobody knew what had truly been happening down there. They knew that Marlon was a pig, but not that he was capable of such horror. And Father made me keep it all to myself. He said that the folk wouldn't understand, said that he believed me, but that talk of magic and supernaturalism would only lead the surviving townsfolk to brand me a witch. He went with me to inspect the bunker, but they were gone. The bodies, the clothes, all gone, swept clean, even the bloodstains. And that was the end of it. The truth of the missing townsfolk was left forever a mystery. None other than my father and me knew that I had ever been down there. I don't know what they think happened. There were spiritual folk around in those times. Maybe they would have believed my story. But I had heard tales of German soldiers kidnapping them during the night. All sorts of ludicrous stories that bore no merit, no rational basis. And that is the whole story, Ted. Grandma Erin whispered, "I'm sorry for the burden." I shook my head. "Aren't you going to tell me that it's all a lie?" she asked. I shrugged. "You'll only tell me off again. I won't make that mistake twice." "Or maybe," she whispered, looking out the window at the silent night, "you won't tell me that it's a lie because you know better." And as much as I didn't want to admit it, I did. That triangular symbol will forever be burnt into my vision. Damon McCory, Ray, Big Country Allen, Jerry Ramey, Dino, Decky, MB Massacre 91, Nelson Asada, Die screaming. Meet Casher, Justin Ford.